Welcome back to Africa 54. Now, Ethiopia has dismissed Egyptian talk of military action against a giant dam it is building on the Nile as psychological warfare and said on Tuesday it would defend itself and carry on with the work regardless. The loud rhetoric between two of Africa's fastest growing nations has raised fears of conflict over water. However, both sides are pursuing a diplomatic compromise of what would be the biggest hydroelectric plant on the continent. The Blue Nile River, one of the Nile's two major tributaries, contributes more than 90% of the Nile's flow, while the other, the White Nile, accounts for less than 10%. Upon completion, the dam will be 145 meters in height and stretch nearly 1.8 kilometers in length. Experts estimate that filling Ethiopia's massive reservoir could cost Egypt as much as 20% of its Nile water in 3 to 5 years. The building of the $4.7 billion hydroelectric dam, Africa's largest, challenges a colonial-era agreement giving Egypt rights to 90% of the Nile's water. Mainly Christian Ethiopia and Muslim Arab Egypt share a long history of suspicion and friction, including over the Nile. Ethiopia says a joint report by both governments supports its assurances it will do no appreciable harm to Sudan and Egypt downstream. It has no plan to use water for irrigation and says that once the reservoir is filled, all the river's water will be free to flow through its turbines. Egypt, however, says it had carried out studies that showed negative consequences. Less water would flow while the reservoir is filling. Once full, more water may evaporate. Egypt, whose 84 million people use almost all the Nile's supply that reaches them to meet their needs, cites colonial-era treaties guaranteeing it the lion's share of the water. Ethiopia and other upstream neighbors say those claims are outdated. Well, for more insight on the significance of the Nile waters to the region, I'm joined in the studio by VOA's senior Middle East correspondent Mohamed Elshinnawi. Mohamed, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you.
Now, you are also a native of Egypt. Just give us a sense of what the Nile means to the millions of Egyptians.
Nile has been the source of life in Egypt. If you go and visit from the south to north, every single village is overlooking one side of the river banks. And 95% of the Egyptian population are living in this strip along the Nile. The Greek philosopher Herodotus once described Egypt as the gift of the Nile. So that tells you how Nile water is the lifeline for all Egyptians. They use it in irrigating their crops. They use it in transportation. Actually, it is a tourist attraction. Exactly. Cruises in the Nile is attracting millions of foreign tourists.
Yeah.
On top of that, it's a source of electricity because of the high dam. Major portion of the Egyptian electricity is generated from the Nile.
So definitely very important. The Ethiopians will equally tell you that their livelihoods are dependent on the Nile, the Blue Nile, because they have to irrigate their farmlands. Most of the country is very dry.
Actually, that's not true compared to Egypt, because Egypt, Nile water is the only source of fresh water.
Yeah.
In Ethiopia and Sudan, they have a lot of rain, so they are not adopting the strict rules of irrigating through pipes and tunnels to have their crops.
Okay.
So, but however, Ethiopia has a right to develop its resources, especially that it has been ignored in the Nile Basin Agreement. It was usually agreement between Great Britain, Sudan, and Egypt. Ethiopia was not involved, so the shares were not equitable. Now, the need for water resources is increasing because by the year 2020, the Egyptian population would reach 95 million. Ethiopians will be 107. So
that's a huge pressure on the Nile.
Yeah.
Now, some will tell you that the Nile, or rather the Egyptians have really benefited from that old archaic British agreement. How can those countries benefit from the Nile without having to look back to the colonial days?
Well, the problem is whatever agreements has been established over decades, it never provided a mechanism for conflict resolution. So there is nothing that stipulates how a conflict would be settled. So for the Egyptians, they have to get away from the old policy of threatening military force. President Sadat did that mistake in 1980 by saying he will just strike Ethiopia if they touch the Nile.
Luna, yeah.
Then came Mubarak when he was having an attempt on his life on Ethiopia while visiting. He ignored Ethiopia totally for the rest of his duration. Then came President Morsi to say last week that all options are open. That's not the way to solve.
So briefly, what's the potential for resolution of this problem?
Well, Egyptian people are more wise than their government. They are sending delegates of ordinary people, intellectuals, politicians to negotiate. Now it is the role of the United States to encourage the two countries not to get involved in military conflict, but rather cooperate, especially that Egypt can provide a lot of technical aspects to help Ethiopia.
Thank you, because this is a lifeline for all those nations. Thanks a lot, Mohamed.
Thank you.
Mohamed Elshinnawi is Voice of America's senior Middle East correspondent. We thank him for joining us here today.